want to go ahead and start and introduce the speakers we have. First, we have Kimball Forrester. Kimball Forrester is the state coordinator for Alabama Arise, a coalition of 150 congregations and organizations that promote fairer public policies on issues affecting low-income Alabamians. Forrester came to Arise in 1991 after 9 years as the Southeast Regional Organizer for Bread for the World in Washington, D.C. A native of Nashville, Forrester received his B.A. from David Lipscomb College and his Master's of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary. For 7 years in the 1970s, he worked in urban ministry projects in the Northeast. So if we could all give Mr. Forrester a warm welcome to be here with us today. Our next panelist is Stephanie Crevens. An engagement associate and 3-time program graduate, Stephanie Crevens connects with Just Faith Ministries' many friends and promoters across the country. Primarily, she works in partnership with potential program participants and graduates and social ministry leaders to invite them to answer the gospel's call of compassion, engagement in poverty, and deepen spiritual life through social ministry. Stephanie has an undergraduate degree in political science from Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, and a master's of public affairs and nonprofit management from IU School of Public and Environmental Affairs. So if we could give her a warm welcome as well. And move to the couch as well. I guess to start with, I wanted to ask if each of you could share a little bit about your respective organization's mission and how that mission ties in with your own personal social justice mission. If you want to start us off, Mr. Forrester.
Okay. Well, Alabama Arise is, as you said, a coalition. I came here from Bread for the World in Washington, where we were working with national issues. Alabama Arise works with state issues. Alabama Arise was a Christian organization. Bread for the World was a Christian organization. Alabama Arise involves both the faith congregations as well as agencies across the state. But Alabama Arise is focused only on issues before the Alabama legislature having to do with low-income people. When I was finishing seminary and trying to figure out, do my own personal, what color is your parachute, I was reflecting on my experience of working in Brooklyn for several years and in inner city Trenton, and felt like to a great degree the work that I did there could better be done by people from the community, really. And I was, this southern transplant into this northeastern context, but I felt like among my skills was persuading Southerners that that poverty was a legitimate form of ministry, and in particular that the decisions made by our government can either enhance what we're doing through our congregations and agencies, or it can take us backwards. And as Tom Dooley likes to say, people are hurting all over Alabama because of decisions made in Montgomery and Washington, and we can do something about that. And when I thought about the things that I cared about, it was poverty and ministry and politics and movies, and 3 of those are involved in Alabama Arise. Mm-hmm. And of course, IMS put out a movie series, so it's all together.
There you go. And Ms. Crevens, if we could also hear from you.
All right, thank you. First of all, huge kudos to you guys for spelling both of my names right and pronouncing my last name correctly, so that's really good. It doesn't happen often. Just Faith Ministries, we form, transform, and inform Christians and Catholics across the country. We have nearly 40,000 graduates that work to be inspired in the gospel call to compassion and live that out in their daily lives. And so we invite the faithful to come together in small faith-sharing groups, usually at their place of worship, to dialogue together, to share, to read books that reveal the world from the bottom up, to reveal poverty from a different perspective than what's normally portrayed in our media and in our social circles. And so we invite people to connect with it in a very personal way and then go out and live that out in the world. And through my various experiences, not only with not only with the programs that we offer at Just Faith Ministries, but then also my life experiences, my own personal ministry is to be a bridge between those who live in poverty and those who live with physical comfort, but maybe spiritual poverty. I grew up in poverty. I had a mom who had a GED and, scraped by, and a dad who left when I was 5, and da-da-da-da-da. And then I moved into a world where I have a master's degree, and I worked in a very professional world and live, income-wise, a fairly middle-class, whatever that bracket is. But also with that, I live in an inner-city community where there's 3 abandoned houses across the street from me. I see people dealing drugs. I see teenagers being arrested for a variety of things. I see little kids who come to my house and want popsicles and to play cards. And I have a mom who brings me food when I'm sick. And I have neighbors who look like me, yet their definition of neighbor seems to be completely different from what mine is. Theirs is, let's call the cops on anybody who misbehaves, not get to know them or their story or their name. And so my personal ministry is to be that bridge that connects people. When we want to say, oh, that's the other and that's different, I want to say, no, that's the same and we're all connected.
Thank you. And we also have Rabbi David Saperstein with us here today. I know a good number of you probably heard from him last night. But Rabbi Saperstein, if you want to touch on how your organization, the Religious Action Center, has been active in its mission of social justice and how that's intertwined with your own personal mission.
I will. If you'll indulge me 60 seconds, I simply want to say an additional word about my friend Jim Wallace, who you were inspired by before, and I'm going to have the opportunity to hear again. There are about 40 national denominations in Washington that have full-time representatives. You can call them lobbyists if you want, in Washington. And there are a number of individual groups spread for the world, on the extraordinary group that you work for, Sojourners that Jim runs. I would have to say without any hesitation that the most influential, the one who has the ear of the most influential people in the country is Jim Wallace. You know him from his public persona, but behind the scenes, senator, congresspersons, he has the ear of presidents, of prime ministers, of Great Britain, of world leaders. His story about Mandela and Bishop Tutu is not an aberration. He plays a major role in the World Economic Forum. I just want you to know that in Jim, you have one of the extraordinary prophetic figures of our time here, and I'm really honored to be his friend. As I said, there are these denominations, and mine is the largest segment of American Jewry. The Reformed Jewish Movement, according to the Pew poll last year, is the largest segment of American Jewry, larger than Orthodox, Conservative, and Reconstructionist Judaism, the other major streams of Judaism combined now. And it has a long history of social justice. In 1961, when the office opened, it felt that if we were going to be true to having a prophetic witness, we had to have a voice where decisions were made in Washington. And if we couldn't have them in every corporate boardroom of the country, at least we could have them with the Congress of the United States and the government of the United States. There have been 3 remarkable people running the office in the 1960s and very early 70s. They left one after the other for very prominent roles: dean of students at a university, the head of our international arm, senior vice president of our denomination. And they wanted someone who was younger, who would be around for a while. And I certainly fit the second bill of being around for a while. I've now been doing this for 40 years, longer than any other head of a denominational office in Washington has ever served. And I think, as some of you know, I may have the opportunity to go into public service now, so I may be finally ending that part of my work. And we work, for me, growing up in the 1950s and 60s, my parents, my father, beloved beloved rabbi at a congregation, one congregation for 50 years, both of them deeply involved in the civil rights movement and all kinds of social justice work, and older brother equally committed. And growing up and being at college in the 1960s, it was just part of the milieu that we had a role in the world, and we had to make the world a better place. And so my religious sensibilities came together when I was offered this job. It was like, wow, if I could ever dream of doing something, it would be this job. I'm able to actually live out that sense of, through bringing Jewish ideals into the world, Jewish values into the world in a very direct way. And what makes all those groups as influential as we are, insofar as we are, it's because we have all the congregations across the country who do extraordinary things. It opens doors of senators, of congresspersons to us. The Jewish community tends to utilize its legitimate democratic rights much more robustly than other segments of the community. Well over 80% of our community voting in elections, even off-year elections, disproportionately involved in all kinds of civic affairs here. So, you know, you put those together, and it has really been an extraordinary venture for us here who have worked at the Religious Action Center to take those prophetic values and help make them real in America.
Thank you, Rabbi. And what you talk about there with the involvement of congregations, I think, leads into my next question, which would be, what issue or issues have each of you seen communities and congregations of faith make the most impact on in your experience? And Ms. Crevens, if we could start with you.
The most impact. I think one story that comes to mind for me, so we have 40,000 graduates across the country, and we have a graduate named PJ who lives in Atlanta, and he's actually on our board, but he started a hospitality center called El Refugio, and they welcome families into a rural part of Georgia to come stay at the home because they have loved ones that are at a detention center for really an undetermined amount of time for being here illegally. And they welcome these families. They give them a free place to stay for their children, and a meal and some companionship while they're there, which is, you know, as you can imagine, a very lonely experience. And for this group, you know, they've changed Atlanta, they've changed their parish, which has been deeply impacted by immigration, and they've changed, I think, a part of this detention center because they're able to bring that love in, and just the individual impact that they can have because they can share this home and bring families back together that wouldn't otherwise be able to connect. For those families, for that parish, for Atlanta, it's really a very significant impact to be able to connect all of that together.
Thank you.
Well, I think the big four for me in my career would be that, first of all, expanding the earned income tax credit back in the 80s under Reagan. And I was working on my responsibility was to work on the southern representatives on the tax committee. So that was Baton Rouge and Knoxville and Huntsville and Pine Bluff, Arkansas. And I remember meeting a guy named Dennis up in West Virginia who was worked for the Navy, and he was telling the group, somehow it came up in the group conversation that he was supporting a wife and 2 kids on $12,000 a year. And I realized, Dennis, we just won $1,000 a year for you in expanded earned EITC benefits. We also, while I was at Bread for the World, doubled the funding for child immunizations worldwide in 1 year. Here in Alabama, we were the last state left that had no protections for tenants. There was a mother whose ceiling fell in her children's bedroom, and she had complained to the landlord and complained about this leaky ceiling. Finally, it fell in on her children's bed when luckily the children were not there. And so she moved out. Well, the landlord came after her for the remainder of the money in the lease. The law was on the landlord's side because Alabama had no tenant protections. And in 1976, we turned that around by getting folks across the state to speak up. Finally, Alabama had the worst income tax threshold in the country. A family of 4 had to pay state income tax on an income as low as $4,600. No other state would you have to do that. And we got that raised from $4,600 to $12,600. So we're still one of the, I think, 19 states that tax people below the poverty line, but it's $40 million better than it was.
Think about social justice in different rubrics, the work that we do in our congregations and at denominations. There's educational work about the great moral issues of our time. There's social service work, the feeding programs, the homeless shelters here that we do, the tutoring programs that we do. And there's advocacy that you were referring to. I think the strongest kind of programs in our congregations weave all three together. Let's hold an educational program on the issues that Brian Stevenson so eloquently put before us. Let people know about the racial divides in the criminal justice system who don't know about it, or about the plight of beleaguered Christian communities in the Middle East today, or Tibetan Buddhists. Let's hold an educational forum on these issues, or what was happening in Darfur, which brought evangelical and African American and Jewish communities together in educating communities. There's also the wonderful social service programs, and there's the advocacy programs that we do. So you have all three. Our congregations are best at the first two, the education and the social service part. The problem is that we can feed as many hungry people as we can feed. But until we stop people from being hungry, we're not going to address the justice issue that's involved. We can help tutor kids who need extra tutoring because the school system they're part of is failing. But until we solve the problem of a failing school system, can't do anything to really make the justice issues really work structurally in this country. So we have to do all of those things. We've been spending a lot of time recently, and I think this is true of a lot of folks in the religious community, trying to help our congregations get more involved in advocacy work, to deal with sources of the problems, not just the symptoms of the problem. And it's the whole faith-based community organizing phenomenon to empower congregations to be part of community organizing efforts, to empower people to stand up for themselves, people in need, to organize and stand for themselves, the kind of advocacy that you're talking about. You know, you can't deal with a problem of illnesses across the world without having child immunizations actually work on a global level. Can't deal with climate change here by growing a garden in your backyard. It's a wonderful thing to do in terms of changing people. We talked about that last night. Got to change policies and people. But if we don't deal with the policies here that get us off of fossil fuel, you can't conserve out of this crisis. We all need to conserve. It's part of the solution. You can't conserve out of this crisis. There have to be major changes in the way we live our lives and major changes in technology and in energy sources in the world if we're going to end this problem. So all of these go together, and we need to emphasize increasingly our congregations need, with respect to the diverse political opinions of people inside our congregations, we need to listen to different viewpoints respectfully. But in the end, where there's a consensus in our congregations, we need to be involved in advocacy to deal with the sources of these problems.
Thank you. And I know you touched on, sometimes these issues seem so large, complicated, that from an individual standpoint, just planting a garden in your backyard, doing those types of things at the individual level aren't going to change the large policy items from the national perspective. So in what ways do each of you think we can, from an individual level, make a difference in those broader policy initiatives, that taking it from the individual and getting those big grassroots changes that we really need? And if we could start with Ms. Crevens.
Me again? All right. I think the key is that we all have to continue to show up. It's that simple and it's that hard. And we all have to figure out what gives us energy and strength to continue to show up. Is it your faith community? Is it your individual meditation? What is it that allows you to keep fighting the fight? And I think, too, changing the language from fighting the fight to working with other people for systemic change. We're not, the language about war and drug, it's a language of violence. And so let's move away from that language. Get off my personal soapbox. But, the other thing is there's some common wisdom that says if you think about these issues and it remains in your heart, then it's only, if it aligns with your head, then it's only just thoughts in your head. And if you feel injustice in your heart, but it remains in your heart, then it's only sentiment. And if you feel the injustice in your stomach and it's compassion, but it stays there, it's only instinct. And so how do you take that out into the world? How do you align those and create action around those? Because they're aligned. And for each individual person, those three things have to remain aligned for you to be sustained. And so if you're not passionate about hunger, don't work on hunger. Work on something that you're passionate about, period. The world needs us to show up. And so show up in something that's meaningful for you, that keeps you energized. That's what I would say.
Good. I think a critical piece is to be involved with a group effort, an organized effort. It's if you contact your legislator and say, I'm concerned about hunger, they're going to say, oh, I am too. But if you say, will you support the school breakfast bill, that's a whole different matter. I remember Dot Shippen running into Senator Walter Owen at the gas station. And while they're both pumping gas, Dot's hitting him up about taking the lowering taxes for low-income people, and he said, "Oh, I know what it was. It was the sales tax on groceries." And Senator Owen said, "Well, poor people get food stamps, and you don't pay grocery tax on food stamps." And she said, but Senator Owen, only about 2/3 of the people who are eligible for food stamps even get food stamps, and even so, there's not enough to make it to the end of the month. So you'd be surprised how much taxes low-income people are paying on their groceries. And at the next meeting of the Tax Reform Committee, one of the chairman of the committee says, well, low-income people don't really pay sales tax on groceries. And Senator Owen said, well, Tom, you might want to look into that, because as I understand it, and he started spouting Dot's line. Another, so that's a one-on-one, more of a group effort like you were talking about. I remember when I was in Washington, we were working on some foreign aid reforms and trying to get the Child Survival Fund, $50 million for the Child Survival Fund, very effective foreign aid program, and the IAD health account. We wanted $130 million for it. And so, as you said, the people at First Presbyterian, Tupelo, Mississippi, studied the issue and then wrote letters to Representative Jamie Whitten, who chaired the Money Writing Committee. Forever. He was one of the most powerful people in the Congress, much less the South. So when our policy analyst on Africa, on foreign aid, went in to visit in Whitten's office and met with his top aide, the guy goes, wait, don't tell me. You want $50 million for the Child Survival Fund and $130 million for the AID health account. And he said, when he came back to the office and reported to me, he said, Kimball, do you realize how many lobbyists in Washington would give their right arm to have Jamie Whitten's aide know what you want before you even ask for it? And that's how, on the state level, when our lobbyist, David Stout, goes in to talk to a legislator, if they've already heard it from back home, his job is easy.
Just to repeat a theme I tried to lift up last night. If we're going to succeed, we have to change people and we have to change policy. You have to do both. One without the other is not going to achieve the goals that we want. So growing gardens in our property owned by our churches, mosques, temples, synagogues, is as much a part of the problem as the policy changes on climate change, or in terms of food policy here as well. We have to deal with policy, and we have to deal with the way people and institutions live their lives. Conserving energy is part of the response to global change. If you think about it, 300,000 houses of worship in the United States. That's more than any other public building in the country. You can take in any community the number of schools, libraries, hospitals, firehouses, police stations combined, and it's outnumbered by the number of houses of worship in that community. Imagine if every one of the 300,000 houses of worship in the United States and the millions of houses of worship on a global level actually purchased renewable energy sources, truly recycled and purchased recycled goods, were growing food to help their community with fresh produce in the air. Imagine what a difference that can make. So I don't want to underestimate that part of it. It has to be part of it. But we have to deal with the policy efforts as well. And I just want to flag that the policy efforts are more challenging because of the diverse views of people in our congregations. And we need to find ways to empower people's voices to be heard that may not be in a majority of any particular church community. And we have to listen carefully and respectfully and engage with ideas, because there's going to be truth found on all sides of this. Every page of the Talmud actually records majority and minority opinions. The Talmud, the great compilation of Jewish laws that were put together beginning at about the time that Jesus of Nazareth lived over the next 500 years. And every page is filled with majority and minority opinions. And when the rabbis ask why, it says, these and these are the words of the living God. The minority and the majority opinion. Only God knows what the answer is. We can only strive using our God-given wisdom to apply what we understand God wants of us to the world about us. But the rabbis say explicitly, and the reason we record the minority opinion is to ensure that it will always be heard, because one day what is now the minority opinion may become the majority opinion. Right? We often are very arrogant in the way we think about other things, and we have to find ways to deal with that. But on the other hand, despite those divisions, on every issue of law about how life should be lived, the rabbis made a decision. It was open, subject to change, but they made decisions of how to apply the laws to the society of which they were a part. That's what the prophetic tradition that we share is all about. So we have to be able to do both of those.
Wonderful. And I think this will be our last question, and if we could start with you this time, Rabbi. I guess going forward in the future, what issue or issues, either from a national or state level, are you most optimistic that communities of faith can make a difference and affect positive change?
Just again, indulge me 60 seconds. In the Jewish tradition, we read different sections of the Torah, of the Bible, every week. The one this week deals with Sodom and Gomorrah, and I'm struck by the line that says, when the angels finally came and took Lot and his family, telling him not to look back. Remember that? And they bring them to the mountains of safety. Here, all the Bible says is, and Lot lingered. Now think about it. Angels from God come and tell you the entire community in which you dwell is going to be destroyed by fire and brimstone. We're going to take you and your family to safety. The only righteous people in the community here. We have to move now in order to do it. And all it says is, and Lot lingered. Needless to say, the rabbis try to figure out where that comes from. And Rashi, the great commentator, medieval French commentator, says, because there was so much money to be made by the status quo. And Ibn Ezra, the great Spanish rabbinic interpreter, made famous by Robert Browning in his famous poem, Rabbi Ben Ezra, Come, Grow Old Along With Me, the best is yet to be, the last which the first is made. He says it is because of fear, and the fear paralyzed them. And then finally, Sforno, the great 17th century Italian commentator, says because of confusion. They didn't know what to do and what the right answer was, and so they weren't able to move. I suggest that's what afflicts us so much now. The militarism, the racism, the crime problem in America, global climate change. There's so much money often in the status quo of the militarism and the climate change issues. There's so much fear about, what if we make the wrong decision, or what's the right way to fight terrorism, to fight crime in this country, in the world, in this country, or climate change, confusion about what's the right answer. Do we become paralyzed? So I think that we can help guide people out of some of those paralyses that lock us into place on climate change. On a global level, I just think that the momentum is moving in the direction of making it self-evident. We cannot continue the way that we are continuing. I think that the religious community, one, Bread for the World, and others, are making a huge difference in economic equality, lifting the poor across the globe. I think the gender differences, we will succeed in that only if religions lead the way on it. And I think there are fundamental changes in many religious communities that are marking the changes happening across the globe that I talked about last night in terms of women and young women being able to get education that's going to transform the world in very profound ways. I think here in this country we are going to get immigration reform through. I really believe it. It is just the power of the issue is just so self-evident to people. There are other issues, sadly, which I think are equally self-evident. Gun violence in America, where I'm very pessimistic about it. The nature of American politics now, the structural problems of money in politics, of safe districts in which the middle is left out and the extremes are growing, is problems that are going to plague American politics for a long time. And I think, and God bless the work that you guys are doing here, I think there's a lot more that can be done at the local and state levels, and a lot of us in national denominations are really beginning to refocus on what could be done at those levels to make a difference on some of these systemic problems.
Thank you.
Just to touch on the Alabama scene only on poverty issues, which is where our expertise is, three, just to touch on, there are a lot of rumors that Governor Bentley is going to change his mind on Medicaid expansion after the election. We just hear that from all different kinds of places, and it makes sense, and we want to keep the pressure on but in a way that doesn't just make him mad and make him obstinate. Secondly, we are going to try again on the 10th anniversary of our Alabama Rises Tax and Budget Handbook. We're putting out a 10th anniversary revision and going to try to see if we can get the conversation going again on untaxing groceries. So that's a question of whether a subject as esoteric as that can take hold. It's really hard for people to really connect with an issue like taxes, but taxes on their groceries don't make sense to a lot of people. But thirdly, the one that really has momentum and that I think we're really going to see something this year from the faith-based pressure from a lot of communities is predatory lending. There are a lot of cities around the state. I think 23 cities have now passed ordinances to curb payday lending in their cities. And, recently Decatur, Huntsville, right? Anniston was the most recent one. And that's one where it's bipartisan, it's across the faith spectrum, all the way from, the right wing to the far left wing. Everybody agrees that you should not take advantage of low-income people. Hebrew scriptures say don't even charge interest to poor people. And yet, we're charging the highest interest. 456% is what's legal in this state for payday lending, and that's what they all charge.
Thank you. And Ms. Crevens, if you could briefly touch on that in 60 seconds or less.
That's all I get?
Wow,
Dang.
we're wrapping up soon.
My work has been connecting with people on the local level, and so I don't see one or two or three issues emerging. I connect with community organizing groups that are often interfaith and working with state and often city statutes that directly impact people's lives on a daily basis. And the ones that are successful are the ones that empower people who live in poverty with leadership skills to communicate on their own behalf, that work in a spirit of dialogue, that work in a spirit of faith and connection with God. And so, every city looks a little bit different. And in one town, the most pressing issue might be getting the box off the application that says, yes, I've been convicted of a past crime. And in another city, it's going to be, we're disproportionately suspending students of color versus their white counterparts. And how can we fix that system now in the school system so that we're not mirroring the prison system with our suspension rates? And so any issue that is relevant to people's lives on a daily basis and empowers those who are disenfranchised, that's going to be where the success is, hands down.
Well, thank you. And I think with that, we'll be wrapping up. I'm sure each of you can talk with our speakers further in the breakout sessions this afternoon. But if we could give them all a round of applause and appreciation.